Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Q&A edition. I am once again joined by Ryan Taylor and Brett Patterson. Gentlemen, how are we doing today?
Very good.
Dude.
Excellent. I'm excited about today. I always really love our team pods, and specifically, I really enjoy our Q&As. It's a really fun way to engage with our audience. And I was going to say audiences, like as if there's multiple, but I guess maybe a little bit.
On different platforms. I'm sure the YouTube audience versus the Spotify audience.
True. Very true. And so on that note, if you're a part of the YouTube audience or if you're part of the Spotify audience, feel free to send us your questions either in the comments of the respective videos, as well as keep your eyes peeled to the Instagram pages of the Exercise Mechanic, of Ryan Taylor, so Dynamis Athletic, and also soon, once Brett is done his ski season, Brett's page for opportunities to contribute questions, your curiosities that we unpack here together as a team. Ryan, why don't you get us going with our first question, and I'll hop in next.
Well, I think a good place to start is one of the questions we had is, how do you run a good podcast?
Well, I mean, you're asking the wrong people because ours sucks. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'll jump in with that, perhaps to lead. But I think first and foremost is to try to have fun. I think maybe a precursor to that would be to establish just what's the goal of it. For us, we talked at length about why we wanted to launch this again. And a huge motivator was to connect with our audience and also to provide interesting and actionable information to trainers. But the connection piece was really important. And so for that reason, we don't want it to be dry. We want it to, be light and easy to listen to and also relevant. So that feels like, I think, a first part. There's other things that I could say with regards to tech, like the importance of a good microphone, the importance of upgrading, if you can, your webcam and stuff like that, which I desperately need to do. But those are some of my initial thoughts. What do you guys think?
So I consume a lot of podcasts of various different types, like comedy, some history, economics, current events, all that kind of stuff. And, there is a glut of podcasts that are just three white guys talking. And I definitely didn't want to be a part of another one of those, three guys just kind of shooting the shit, as much as I love to do that with you guys. So having a focus and a theme, I think, is really important. And some, on each episode, there's something that's kind of guiding our discussion, and we're not just kind of talking about whatever's going on with our days. And I think that would help to keep me engaged as a listener, for sure.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of echo the same sentiments as you guys, where, I remember the meeting or two meetings we had prior to starting this in its current iteration, and we all agreed that we didn't just want it to be, as you said, three white guys just shooting the shit. And I think we're all very similar. At least something that I think of is any of the content that I try to create, the lens that I want to look at it through is, what do I like as a consumer?
Yeah.
And I get bored very quickly with podcasts that just have no meat to them. So I wanted ours to actually have something that, would be valuable to listen to, both with the sort of roundtable discussions that we have, as well as any guests that we bring on. I guess one area that I could speak to as well is I do think that there's a lot of value in when you have guests coming on, making sure that they're guests that you think have something unique and valuable to provide. I also think that a mistake that I see some hosts make, and that I try not to make, is they forget sometimes that I think that the guest on your podcast, they're the star of the show.
Yes, for sure.
So something that with the guests that we've had on, really trying to just kind of nudge them along and give them prompts, but the floor is really theirs. And then that brings me to my last point, which is, I think, being prepared. So,
yes.
Every single time I come into any of these, I always have a page of notes written down, just an idea of, whether it's these like topics that I want to talk about. When we did the case study, if we have a guest, I've got a handful of questions. Usually half of them I don't even get to, but I just want to have enough prepared so that there's a theme and we come across as professional. And maybe my last
come across is the important word.
Not always effective.
We're definitely not professional, but we try to come across as such.
The last point I would make, which was something that was brought up to us recently, is now I try to mute myself when I'm not talking because I just breathe really heavy and apparently it's distracting.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, and just the nature of you currently being in your off season and having a lot of mass on your chest, right? And it's interesting. A few thoughts came up for me, which is the importance of having a team. Excuse me. Two thoughts. Number one, when we first relaunched this, it was a team initiative. And I don't know if you guys remember, I mentioned that like me doing not only like one team pod a week, which we've committed to, but also with the aim of doing one guest a week. That sounds really bad, but hosting one guest a week is something that's difficult for me to do when it comes to setting all of that up, doing the background research, et cetera, for us to be able to stick to this kind of schedule. And one of the things that has been really huge in moving this forward has been having you guys I'm going to say in my corner, but having you guys on the team, because it's not about me, it's about the initiative, and having people that can take a greater brunt of the work and the lead on certain things, while I take a greater load of the brunt of the lead on others, has been really great, because then that means that I'm to a lesser degree the bottleneck. So a thought on this has to do with just like, if you can have a team, even if it's like an editing team of people that you've met through Fiverr or another website like Upwork or what have you, where you can outsource the editing, or if you can outsource, getting ideas, or like pitching to hosts, or outsource the creation of questions. Like that's been something that on my end has happened, because right now my schedule is so loaded where I'll be skidding to a halt 30 minutes before our episode. And I've done some research on the guest, but not as much as I'd like. And I'm like, fuck, like this isn't ideal. And then lo and behold, I look in my chat and there's a message from Ryan that's like, hey man, here are my questions. Here's what I think is interesting about this person. And I'm like, sick. So then I look at that. I have a Cole's notes of some really great jumping off points. I can then go and check again for like 15 minutes, look into this person, and then have a good enough idea to at least have an informed conversation. So those are some of my thoughts. Do you guys have any other final thoughts on this before we move on to our next topic?
I just wanted to kind of double click on your mention of outsourcing, and like specifically outsourcing the things that you're weakest on or that you've got the least time for. Because like you might come into, deciding to do a podcast and you're like an audio whiz and you've done, live sound before, audio recording before. You probably don't need a lot of help in the editing side of things or knowing what equipment to buy. But maybe you need a little bit of help in, the presentation of the thing, or creating a plan, or, whatever it might be. But knowing where your weak spots are and where you might need some help to reach out to, I think is really important.
Yeah, no doubt. Go ahead, Ryan.
I think before we get to the next question, the last thing I would add is just sticking with it.
True.
We talked about this sort of last week, kind of this idea that, anything that's worth doing is worth overdoing, and sticking to the process, whatever. But in everything that I've ever read and everything I've ever heard from people who have had successful podcasts, it takes a long time. Unless you get very lucky, you're probably putting in a lot of work with very little return. I don't know exactly how long we've been doing this at this point, but I remember like we had episodes that were getting like 6 views and 4 views. And then we'd get like 50 or 60 views. And now we've had a few where it's like over 100 views. And it doesn't sound like very much. But, I think of the Modern Wisdom podcast hosted by Chris Williamson, which is one of my favorites. And I think that he had said, I don't think he made a cent from his podcast until 3 years into producing it.
Yeah.
Like he was well into the triple digits of episodes. Even Steve Hall, who we've had on here before, the Revive Stronger podcast that is quite successful. Same thing for him. He, you know, it took him years and hundreds of episodes before this thing has kind of become well known. So I think that that's one of the big things. It can be very easy to get discouraged. But I also think this is where, you know, this kind of team format as well, if the process is just fun, like I actually view these as just being like a fun thing that I get to do every week. And, you know, obviously, hopefully in time, it continues to grow and grow. But if nothing else, it's just enjoyable to do, which makes it easier to stomach the how slow the process can be sometimes.
Yeah, no doubt, man. And it's like the to kind of extract wisdom from I guess this quote or this idea that like he who likes walking will walk further than the person that like necessarily has just like set a goal, right? Like if you can truly enjoy the process, it becomes easier to weather all those moments that where maybe you would quit because you're just having a real bad day, or you get into an argument with your spouse and you're just like, fuck this, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then things spiral. And the next thing you know, it's been months that you haven't released an episode. The fact that it is fundamentally enjoyable, which I attribute not only to the content itself, but also to the public, you know, getting to do this with two really great friends of mine, and then also getting to meet guests and learn from them. Like it's a selfish thing, you know, in many ways. So I very much agree with you. The last thing that I'll say before we move on, perhaps, is just on the note of software. Podcasting 5 years ago, you used to, generally speaking, you needed to have various pieces of software to be able to record the audio and or the video. You then needed to have a subscription to another platform to maybe do the editing of both of those things. You then needed to have a subscription with like Anchor or another hosting platform. You needed to have another subscription as a means of editing and adding subtitles. Excuse me. Like it was a lot of work. And now, you know, one of the software that we use, which is called Riverside, it's all in one. You know, we click record, it does its thing, it records everything to the cloud. You can, with a click of a button, without exaggerating, you can create subtitles. You can go in and edit them easily. You click another button and it's immediately published to via Spotify. You get downloaded and upload it to YouTube. Like it's not that complicated. And so fortunately for us, it's the barrier of entry to creating a decent product. Of course, here, we're not talking Hollywood level podcast here, but for us to create what I think is a pretty decent product, it really isn't that complicated. And I'm not someone who's very tech savvy, and, you know, I'm the one that does essentially all of the background stuff. And it's not that complicated. It's not that labor intensive, which is important when it comes to being prolific with the episodes. So I personally would absolutely recommend, if someone is looking to start a podcast, to look into something like Riverside. There's another one I think called Podcastle. Podyard, I think, is another one. Don't quote me on that. There's a few different ones. Those softwares are very much worth it, and they're not that expensive.
I recorded a podcast a number of years ago with some friends prior to this software becoming ubiquitous. And I had an older computer too that I didn't really trust. And so I had the Zoom call on a Chromebook that I was having the like direct discussion with. I had an audio mic, like a live audio mic, analog mic, like right at my face because it's a live audio mic, going to like a digital workstation, basically had to plug in like to like analog to digital, recording on my desktop. And then just in case, I also had my cell phone recording audio in case the computer went down. So I had like 3 devices in front of me, had to like export everything. They had to like sync everything up and make sure it all kind of matched. Like it was a lot more challenging a process than this is.
For sure. Absolutely. Cool. Awesome. Let's get into our next question. So Brett, I'm not sure if you caught this before we were recording, but about 2 or so months ago, there's a gentleman here in Geneva who asked me a question about his shoulder pain. And fortunately, it's gone really well. His shoulder's doing really great. So, yay. But the other thing that's been really cool is he reached out to me a few weeks ago and he was like, hey, man, can we meet up for coffee? Kind of interested in making a move to become a trainer. So today we ended up getting a coffee. We just kind of shot the shit about the career of personal training, what that looks like, where he might start, et cetera. And so I encouraged him to send me some questions, which he's done. And so we'll start with this because he has trouble with marketing. So what he wrote was, how do you define your target group? And also, what do you do if marketing yourself is not something that comes to you naturally? What do you guys think?
Oh boy. These I feel like these are targeted questions to me.
I can start. So if we talk about how do you find your target audience?
How do you define your target audience or your target group? And then the second piece is, what do you do? How do you navigate the need to market if it doesn't come to you naturally?
And is he a personal trainer or he's getting into the online space?
Hasn't been decided yet. It's an idea that he's kind of chewing on.
I'll answer this from the perspective of as an in-person trainer, mainly because I think that, we've talked about this on numerous occasions on this show at this point, that I think generally that's the career path that makes the most sense, is working as an in-person before moving to kind of the remote coaching side of things.
Can you double click on why that's something that you feel? I know this is something that we share, but can you just pull on that thread a little bit? Because that's something that's not something that he and I talked about today a ton.
So I think for a wide variety of reasons, it's a good idea. This is actually something when I was on Paul O'Need's podcast a couple of months ago, we talked about this at length. And to me, it boils down to a couple of things. The biggest thing is when you work in particular for like a corporate gym, you have so many opportunities to make mistakes because you will. Mm-hmm. And there's still going to be business that's going to be in front of you. Mm-hmm. The problem when you have limited access to potential clients, if you're burning through those because your skill set isn't there, eventually the well dries up and could dry up quite quickly. Had a little stroke there. So you kind of have an opportunity to go through some growing pains with the security net of being with another facility, another company. And I think that there is no substitute to the skills that you learn as a trainer, i.e. all of the hands-on technical skills, being able to coach cue, read body language, all of that stuff, being able to actually be empathetic and caring for your clients, because that is a massive part of this industry. And there's a lot from the business side as well. So if you do work for like a bigger chain, oftentimes within their onboarding and sort of development process, there's going to be elements of them teaching you sales and business management, all of which you're going to need if you go on your own and if you work on the online space. So I think that you have kind of this opportunity to get all of your reps in with a little bit more security. Mm-hmm. And just at a much higher rate than you will if you're on your own. And I don't think that transfer goes the other way. So that's kind of my first point. So with that being said, I think that you're determining your target audience. If you're very new, I think your target audience is anybody that fits in your schedule. And I would say is within one iteration of your skill set. So what I mean by that is, if you have somebody who has a goal or they're presenting with, certain things that you have absolutely no idea where to start with, I think you owe it to that client to outsource to somebody else. If you have a general idea of the thing that they're talking about, and it is something that you can learn in a relatively short time frame and service that client, I think that that's a growing opportunity. So that's why I say like an iteration, like a skill point outside. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I think you've got to do what's right for the client. It's funny at this stage, I probably refer out to other people more often than I ever did, because there's a particular skill set that I think I have that works with certain clients. Mm-hmm. And if it's not within that, I think other people are a better fit. And then what was the second question again about marketing?
How do you
Second
market
piece,
yourself?
yeah,
How do you
how do
market
you market
yourself?
yourself if it's not something that comes to you naturally?
I think that you market yourself based on results, client results, and your own. I think that this is an industry that attracts attention the most. And if you do really well with clients, talk about what the results are. If you yourself are somebody who is in some kind of athletic venture or like competition, present that as well. The more that people see that you have a track record of success, the more they're going to be drawn to you. I think
Love
that
that.
there's a lot of there's a lot that people can kind of bullshit online, but ultimately what matters is, do you get results with your clients or not? And are your
Mm-hmm.
clients happy working with you?
Cool.
Beautiful. Good. Brett, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I think you're bang on in the Ryan on the kind of target audience. There's a quote from Miles Davis, who is not behind me, by the way. That is Louis Armstrong, but famous jazz trumpeter Miles Davis said something along the lines of like, "It takes a long time to learn how to play like yourself." Um, and the same idea in any industry, you know, it like takes a while of learning to figure out like, what is my target audience, what am I really good at, what do I love, and exposing yourself to a lot of different clients earlier on from different backgrounds, different abilities, different age groups, and different sizes of groups. Even like maybe you're the kind of person who really goes nuts over group classes and motivating a large group, and maybe a single person seems kind of boring to you. So maybe that is the direction you go. But it takes some time to learn that. And I think that, you know, spending some time in a gym, taking on everybody you safely can, is
Yeah.
a good way to kind of find your voice and learn how to play like yourself. Um, and you know, I realized, you know, 5 years or so into my career that like I was trying to figure out what my target audience was, because I still had a lot of clients from disparate areas. And I asked one of my clients once, like, who do you see as my niche? And she responded, high functioning weirdos. and
Mm-hmm.
and it does kind of fit. It's hard to kind of market directly to those folk, but in my personal practice, that's definitely who I've kind of gelled with the most. But now working a lot of different areas, like, you know, doing trainer management and marketing for a gym, obviously my net is a lot wider, and I'm referring people to a number of different trainers who've got a different skill set. So, you know, that is a different skill set on its own, probably beyond the scope of this question. But knowing other people's personalities and how those clients could conceivably fit is a good skill set to work on too, if you're interested in getting into management like that. In terms of marketing yourself, is something that I'm still working on. I find it really hard to put myself
This
out there, and
theme keeps coming back,
I
Brett. It just keeps
know.
coming back, man.
Definitely
I'm
like
actually
some
the one that planted this question. I just made this up.
definitely like some insecurities there with putting myself out there, and something that I'd like to work on more. Um, so I think you two are probably better positioned to answer that question. Um, but I think that, you know, being confident in yourself, your abilities, your skills. And one thing that I'm going to be working on a lot this spring is being confident in my ideas when I present them, and not being afraid that, you know, even if they do get some pushback, knowing that I know what I know and I can defend these ideas if necessary. Or if somebody brings up a very, you know, good point, you know, it's just an idea and it isn't me. And it's okay to back down on it if I need to.
No doubt. So I have a few follow-ups, but I'll start with the one that you just finished with, which is that do your due diligence, do the best you can to present great ideas, and also not being attached to being right. Because I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's like a requirement for learning, right? And so like a growth mindset, a resilient, anti-fragile mindset is to welcome contradictory ideas, to welcome constructive feedback that you can then use to approximate truth. You know, I think that, at least in my experience, one of the big things that gets in the way of sharing ideas, one of the things, and there are many, of course, but one of them is just allocating way too many fucks to the opinions of others, and also allocating way too much importance to being right, in contrast to choosing to value yourself for your ability to learn and grow and develop.
Mm-hmm.
And which is a hard thing to shift to if you've had like the former type of associations for all of your childhood, which is very much my case. And I think one of the big reasons why I've really had to work on my relationship with failure, which we touched on a little bit on that last episode.
But I think convictions are still important, and like having some concrete stuff
Yes.
deep down is important, but those aren't the ideas, those are the ideals, you know, like my conviction that like helping other people is important, or that, you know, continued learning is important, and maintaining nuanced positions and an open mind and all those things. Those are like what I keep deep down in my heart and I'm never going to let go. But those aren't the like, you know, knee valgus opinions I have.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Always comes back to knee valgus. No, that's great. I love that. So I have a few other follow-ups here. You know, coming back to his question, I love everything that you guys said. There's nothing that I disagree with. These are just additions and perhaps clarifications. So I think that sometimes when people talk about clarifying your target group, very often people think of it within the context of demographics and results. And as much as I think that in time, if you can get to that place, that's great, because you'll speak to a very clear audience. But at the beginning, and by beginning, I mean probably like your first like 6 to 10 years, I think that the niching down, so to speak, that one should do is about tripling down on your interests and your quirks and your personality and the things that set you apart from others. And so what does that look like? That means just like honoring your curiosities, not hiding your quirks, not hiding your opinions, for the sake of attracting people who are actually interested in who you actually are, in contrast to attracting people who are attracted by this, you know, mirage that you've created of yourself, which you can't keep up for a long time anyways. So I think that like at the beginning, when it comes to target group and niching down, I think it's less about niching down into a demographic and with a certain objective. And I think it's more about like the personality piece and just like leaning into your curiosities. Because truly, I think that if we think about building a business, this is something that Paula Need has said, Steve Hall has said, every other individual that we've hosted on the podcast that we've talked about, you know, growing a business, there is not one that has said that growing a business happens faster than you think. Not one. They've all said it's fucking long. You think it's going to take 5, it's going to take 15. And so you might as like one of the things that drives consistency and adherence is actually enjoying aspects of it. And so considering sustainability, I think matters, which is why I think niching down on yourself, so to speak, and honoring your personality and your curiosities matters a lot. Other piece when it comes to defining your target group, I totally agree. At the beginning of your career, unless you're crystal clear on exactly what this looks like, and I know this gentleman is looking to specialize a little bit more when it comes to like trail running, and because he himself is very much a trail athlete, so there's that piece. But generally speaking, you know, being willing to, for the sake of getting in reps, to deviate from this perhaps rigid idea that you have in your mind for the sake of learning, which kind of comes to the point that you made earlier, Rye, of like, I forget how you said it, like one standard deviation, I think was the language you used, of like, this is a little bit outside of my skill set, but not too much. And so I'm going to take a swing at this and I'm going to do my due diligence. I think that matters for professional development, because if you only do one thing, generally speaking, I think you can be brittle. You can have like a brittle business model, which is of course not something that that we want. And then coming back to the last piece of this, which is what do you do if marketing is not something that comes to you naturally? What do? You find a way to market yourself in a manner that doesn't feel super fucking gross. And so, start with what are pieces of content that you like to consume. Use that as perhaps a jumping off point for as like a means of inspiration for your own stuff. And also allocating way less importance to how you feel. I think that like with like doing anything meaningful is going to have aspects of it that suck and that you don't like. I don't like, I truly have a lot of difficulty and I do not enjoy the process of editing the podcast into shorts. I don't like the process of creating content. I truly don't like any of it. But the objectives that we have require that we put information out somehow so that we can inform trainers that we exist, that we can teach them through the stuff that we put out what we stand for and what we stand against, so that way they can then choose whether or not they want to, link arms with us with the exercise mechanic movement and help us improve this industry. And so like giving in to the discomfort that I feel with creating marketing content or by cold emailing people, which is really uncomfortable for me, like, hey, can I talk to you about our course offerings? That's literally how I feel. Hey, I fucking hate that. It sucks. And also, like, what do you want? Do you want to be comfortable? Or do you actually want to move towards your objectives, right? Like, how many times do you guys with your own training have you needed to like just stuff down the chicken and broccoli, right? If you're dieting, you're like, fuck, I don't want to eat this meal. This sucks. But like, tough titty, it's a requirement for your goals, or I think I used this example once before, but when I was training for the marathon, there was one day, it was 9 p.m. It was 5 degrees out and it was raining. My headlamp broke. And I had an hour and 45-minute tempo run to do on Aviation Parkway, which is dangerous because it was like night, rain, no headlamp. And I'm doing like fast, like tempo bouts. Not smart, but I was like, I've committed to this goal and this is something my coach told me to do. So, and like, I don't want to do it. I'm cold. I'm tired. It's been a long day. I don't want to go out and do this, but like tough, you go do it. So, I think that once again, finding ways to move forward is important within the context of marketing. Like I touched on, and I'd be curious to know whether or not you guys have any additional thoughts to build on this, but like start with things that you like, because it's very likely that the people that are interested in you and what you have to say, that they might have similar interests when it comes to not only the content of the content, but also the vehicle itself. Like, is it text? Is it video, et cetera? And then just iterate, give yourself a long runway, do it for a long time. So that way you can go from sucking at the thing to actually becoming proficient.
Mm-hmm. When I started my business, my idea was that I was going to create some online marketing as kind of evergreen content. So my website and my social media was never intended to be super active. It was just, the intent was, if I've got a referral or another person refers someone to me, I've got an online presence that somebody can check out and see like, okay, this is a real person. He seems to have an okay head on his shoulders. And I can reach out to him comfortably and like kind of get to know me a little bit prior to meeting me, which was reasonably successful. But now doing a little bit more kind of active work, especially with you guys, I'm realizing that that's, a bit short-sighted, or at least not aligned with my current goals, and I've got to be a little bit more active with it in order to make it work. But it did work for my intents, and I kind of, put the message out that I am an educator more than just somebody who's counting reps. And that was kind of my guiding light in creating evergreen content for social media, and the text and stuff on my website was like, come to me if you want to learn how to do this yourself, and not just have somebody who's there telling you to do 20 squats and watching you, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much else to add from what both of you guys said. I think we've more or less covered it.
Sweet. Okay. I've got some other questions, but Rye, I know you've got a few from Instagram, so why don't you pick one from the hat?
So we have a handful, a bunch of different topics. I'm curious about this actually. What do you see as the biggest threat to the fitness industry?
Right now, or just generally speaking?
I guess either or. I'll say what I think, because I think in general, the fitness industry is growing and growing and growing. There's more money and more popularity within this space than there's ever been. And I think that the collective social mindset is that fitness is really important. I think there's more normality to people hiring fitness professionals. So I think for the most part, the momentum is going in the right direction. Honestly, the biggest threat that I see, because I do feel like it is happening kind of before our eyes, is I think that there is the potential for enough economic turmoil, both within our own country, but just globally, that I think it makes people nervous to spend on big ticket items like personal training, coaching, etc. And that's often where people will cut their expenditure, because a lot of people have to pay their mortgage and pay for their car insurance and their groceries. So I would say like the industry as a whole, I think, is growing and getting better year by year. I think the biggest threat is actually outside the industry. And I don't know if any of us individually have really any ability to affect it.
Mm-hmm.
We are a luxury.
Yeah. It's interesting. This is, once again, with the gentleman that I was speaking with today, this is a topic that came up because I've had, over the course of the past month, more conversations that I can count with trainers that are nervous because they acknowledge that, like you said, Brett, it's a luxury. And people not only need disposable income to be able to invest in what is essentially kind of like private healthcare in a way, but not only do they need to have the means, they also need to be safe to invest those resources. So even if someone has a lot of money in the bank, economic uncertainty can make people a little bit more apprehensive at investing in their health, which truly, right, when I'm happy you brought that up. That's why I asked the question of like just in general or right now, because I do view the relationship between Canada and the States, specifically the whole tariff situation and how that's going to be shaking things up in North America and also abroad. I can't see how that won't affect not only the money in the pockets of the masses, at least in the short to medium term, but even if it didn't, I think that the economic uncertainty will likely lead to people being a little bit more apprehensive with investing in their health, and specifically with personal training.
Yeah, I want to add to that, actually, if I may.
Of course.
So, two things. I would say I'm lucky enough where my own business hasn't necessarily been hit by it, at least at this point, because I don't really work with a lot of in-person clients, which is where the personal cost gets very high.
Yes.
It is an advantage to online coaching, is just that the ticket price isn't quite as significant as in-person training. But I do know, we all have friends within the industry. There are clients where, they own a business that makes like metal parts or something, or they have a company that does installation and stuff like that. And they're getting, those businesses are really getting hit by the tariff situation.
Mm.
And that has led to some of these people putting their training on hold, some outright canceling.
You've
Because
experienced that yourself?
so not me, but I know people who
Okay.
like their clients, like their
Yes.
client owns like a warehouse, or like they've got a machine shop. I'm clearly not a handy person. I don't know what it's called. But they essentially have a bunch of metal that turn into parts. They sell it down to the US. And because of all of the tariff situation, they're getting fucked right now.
Yeah.
So now, this client is like, I don't really know if I have a business that can generate income. Spending $1,000 a month on personal training is probably like not super smart for me financially. And I've seen that with friends of mine that are in the personal training space full time. And the other thing I will add, I'm always the guy that brings this up, but the other thing that's been interesting that I've experienced personally is, we talk about the PED side of things with competitive bodybuilding.
I knew you were going
The
to bring up
reality
steroids. I knew
yeah,
it.
I know. But this is something I will say, because this has actually been a big concern of myself and other friends of mine that are, in bodybuilding. These things do not get manufactured in North America.
Yeah.
They get manufactured generally in China is the most common place. And because of the uncertainty with what's going on with the States, a lot of things have been seized. Costs are going up, or like access is completely diminished, which has then led to any local costs are going through the roof. So it's a very real problem for the people that are in that space. And it all boils down to just this uncertainty with what's happening, globally. So obviously, trainers are getting their businesses affected, but there's a lot of people on the enhanced side of bodybuilding, powerlifting, etc. And that's another thing that they're running into as well. So I think we're all being affected by it in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys see the rise of social media as a generally positive or negative effect on the fitness industry, or both?
Both.
I think net
I,
positive.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would say net positive as well. I think the volume of negativity is higher, but so too is all the volume of positivity. I do think that there's a greater degree of globalization and connectivity, which is great. I do think that people have access to information now in a way that they never did before. Like ET, I'm sure you remember, let's say 10 to 15 years ago, it was so hard to find training information. Like I was on like T Nation forums, and it's some fucking guy from Ohio that wrote an article, and I was like, this is the one article that's been written on the internet about training in the last month. So it was very challenging to be able to get educated as a trainer. Nowadays, you have so much free information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what comes with that is there's also a lot of BS that exists.
Yes.
And I think that this is where I think having social media literacy really matters. Being able to properly and skeptically go through the information that is out there and be able to make good determinations of what's valid and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, man. So we kind of talked about the economic, or touched on the economic piece, and you just touched on how would I say, from an information management perspective was the other piece that I really wanted to touch on, which is just that, like, what would be, I think the question was, what's the biggest threat? What do we view as being one of the biggest threats of the fitness industry? One of the word that I wrote down is just like intellectual tribalism, just like us versus them mentality, a lack of nuance. a lack of like very much losing the forest for the trees, shit like you should only squat to 90 degrees because it's optimal, in contrast to like when might you and when might you not. Like it's a far more interesting question, and it opens you up to opportunity in contrast to limiting you. So
I think the
I,
answer is when Jesus wants you to squat to 90 degrees.
when homeboy JC wants you to go to 90, you go to 90, right? And yeah, so, I think that it's so ridiculous. But, I think that if that is widespread enough, that could be the death of the industry when it comes to its credibility and efficacy. Or perhaps the death of like how good it could be. Because I think that like the industry as a whole growing requires an increasing amounts of critical thinking because of the volume of information. I think it's going to a greater degree, require increasingly a clinical understanding of exercise, rehabilitation, physiology, etc. And like the antithesis to those things is like just like not thinking, right? Like what we're talking about here is being able to just think. And so I think that a lack of thinking would be the thing that would kill the industry. But I have one more thought, Ryan, because I know you want to jump in. Because just you mentioned there's someone that who is a trainer who, like, some trainers who their clients have put their training on hold and stuff like that. And I'm across the pond, right? I'm in Geneva, and I think it was like on day 4 of Trump being in office. It was definitely like within his first week when he pulled all funding from the WHO. On that day, I was supposed to have a consultation with a woman, very qualified lead for in-person training here. And she called me like an hour before our consult, sobbing. She was like, "I'm so sorry. Like, I need to cancel. I just lost my job." And and so it's just like from one day to another, like this is a very real thing. We're not just talking about cost of living affecting disposable income and economic uncertainty creating fear and a resistance to parting with resources, but it also is leading to people like actively losing their jobs. So that was the last thing I wanted to say. Ryan, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, something I wanted to add as well. Maybe this ties together what Brett had talked about, social media being net positive or net negative, as well as maybe a threat to the industry. And this might sound ironic considering generally my position on this show. I think one of the other things is actually the normalization of drug use. And I think
I knew you were going to talk about drugs. I knew it.
But so it's the funny thing is though, and I've seen a couple of content creators talk about this, and I've also seen this, use movies as an example. So I remember, like, we all probably saw the first X-Men movie in 2000, I think was when it came out. You look at Hugh Jackman in that movie versus what he looks like in his 50s, and the physique is insanely different. And people considered him to be very muscular and in shape in the year 2000. Now, if people look at that, they would say he has a dad bod.
Did you know in the first movie, his name wasn't actually Hugh Jackman. It was Hugh Smallman.
I was going to go for that.
Now he's known as Hugh Jacked Man.
I was going to go for Little Ackman, but yours is good too.
But I think that the perception of his physique, I think it is just, it's a symbol of what has happened. I'm going to say in particular with male physiques, but I think it applies to women as well. Mm-hmm. I think you see so many people in the industry now being put in a position where just in order to have people's eyeballs be on them and for people to view them as credible, they get pushed into this position where they end up having to use drugs to have a physique that people even take seriously, which is a shame because I think, there are exceptional coaches and trainers and educators that, don't use any of that stuff. And obviously, your body is going to look different. But what ends up happening is I think that sometimes those people get disregarded, which I think is terrible. Whereas you get people who are 21 years old. I've seen this actually quite a bit lately, where you'll get like young 20s women where there's like a normalization of anabolic use amongst females. And 5 years in, there's a lot of masculization that's happened with their face. Their voice is very deep. And there's this pressure to do this in order to be taken seriously online, to be taken seriously as a coach, so on and so forth. So I actually do think that that is a big, I think that that's a risk within the industry, sorry, where on one hand, I do like that there's more transparency and there's more education around this, but it has also meant that I want to say there's almost too much normalization for it, or at least there's almost less discussion about the risks associated than there should be.
Yeah, and I wonder if the increasingly prolific use of PEDs, we probably can't trace it down to one thing, but for the sake of discussion, I wonder if it would be more so traced down to like body standards changing and people feeling this unspoken pressure to use. Like, is it that's driving increased consumption, or is it the fact of people speaking about it openly? And I definitely have an opinion on this, and it's that I think it's more so the former than the latter that's leading to folks feeling the need to consume. And so, if that is true, that's the big if. But if that's true, then I think that what we need is actually probably more education about just what are the cost benefit, like what are the more cost benefit analyses, of the potential upside, the potential downside, and so that way people can have informed risk.
I think there's a nugget of good buried deep down in there, and that's that it's people have realized it's okay to say out loud that I'm training to look good. And I feel like that was really hidden for a long time. It was like, well, I'm training for these goals, but like secretly I just want a six pack. And now people are just kind of openly like, yeah, I want huge arms just so I have huge arms. And I think that's really, really healthy. But it has come along with like, I need to get there as fast as I possibly can. Or like I need to look like the guy who's got absurd arms on Instagram and not just like kind of big.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing is behaviors are perpetuated when they're rewarded. And the reality is those people that are doing these things get rewarded, I will say, on social media, and then ultimately, in their bank account, most likely. And I believe I saw something recently where it was, I don't know what the numbers, like the number of students, but it was like high school students were polled what their preferred career was. And it was like 85% of grade 12 students, their number one career choice was being a social media influencer. Mm-hmm. Like that's the thing that people want, at least like in the younger generations. And then they then have behaviors that lead them to try to achieve that, which is often, doing things too fast, too soon, right? Without much consideration for like the long-term consequences. And I think we can extend that beyond, just PEDs. It's relevant because that's within our industry and that I think can be abused. But I do think that people end up having risky behaviors in order to drive their social media platform. Like I saw a video recently of this guy. I don't know what his name was, but it's just this kind of like rat race of having the most outrageous content on social media. And this guy was duct taping between these two poles in like a parking lot and then running through it. So it was like one strip of duct tape, 10 strips, 100 strips. And he jumped, it was like 10,000 strips. And he runs into it full speed, bounces off it, hits his head on the curb, concusses himself, gets rushed to the hospital because he's like foaming at the mouth. But it's like, So he did this stupid thing where he now has brain damage to get views online.
Yeah.
Like it's an outrageous idea when you think about it, but it's everywhere, right? Because that's what people are striving for.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure. I have one more question I'd like to table for you guys, training related. Is there anything you want to say about this last topic of what's the biggest threat to the fitness industry before we move on?
I think we're good.
All right, cool. So this one's very training specific from the Graham. So if you notice your body I'll start from the beginning. If you notice that your body is reacting differently to the same training stimulus over time. So what we're talking about here is that there's a decrease in the efficacy of the training stimulus. Maybe that training stimulus is also giving you increased fatigue. You haven't changed anything. It's just that like this thing that was working for you isn't working for you anymore. And it's also just kind of seemingly creating a big fatigue cost. What are your thoughts of how you might change your training? What would be some of the variables you would look at?
I mean, like looking at kind of the big important things, sleep, food, and total volume would be first. You know, maybe you don't think you've changed anything, but maybe your quality of sleep isn't there, even though you're lying down for 8 hours a night. But the quality isn't where it should be. Maybe there's increased life stress that's influencing it, or you know, maybe you've been gradually increasing total volume, you know, of your workouts, not in a really perceptible way, but adding intensity and, you know, adding the odd set here and there. And it's just kind of like coming to a head. Those would be the first things that I'm going to look at. If all feels the same, you know, that's a lot of variables, but if truly nothing seems to have changed from those variables, then I would start to back off that particular exercise. Maybe come up with an alternative that affects similar tissues, but you know, less total load. Um, Maybe it's just swapping that exercise out entirely. But yeah, the first kind of looking at the basics.
Great. Ryan, what do you
Yeah,
think?
I would agree with everything that Brett said in terms of I would be looking essentially at the recovery piece first. And if there's additional stressors outside of training. One of the things I would add is I would also look at the training execution. So to me, when we look at how can we train, I'm going to put this in quotes, optimally. I always just think of it as like training economy, which is there is for every action in the gym, every exercise that you do, there's a stimulus benefit and there's a fatigue cost. And when I think of how I execute a particular movement, my goal is to create the biggest gap between those two, like to have the sum be or I should say the difference to be as great as possible.
High stimulus, low fatigue.
Correct.
Yeah.
So one thing that we know, and I think Menno Henselman has posted a variety of studies on this, essentially so long as training intensity is equated or proximity to failure is equated, lots of stuff works. So, you know, partial range of motion versus full range, really slow tempos versus, you know, fast tempos and bouncing to the bottom, they all can lead to quite similar results. But to me, where the difference is how much fatigue, how much injury risk, etc., are you potentially accruing. So if we can find a way of managing that fatigue by just improving exercise execution, that would be another area that I would look at. And then the last thing that I would note is depending on how far this person is in their training age and how experienced they are, I think there's a certain degree of accepting that things will slow down. You know, it's not unreasonable. Let's say you're like an 18-year-old kid and you're picking up a weight for the first time. A lot of people put 10 or 20 pounds on their first year of training, you know, and maybe it's 8 to 12 pounds their second year, so on and so forth. You get to the point where you've been training consistently and sort of doing all the right things for a decade. You are busting your ass for like 2 pounds of muscle a year.
Hmm.
so that the differences, training cycle by training cycle are going to be imperceptible. So I think, as you had mentioned, Brett, if you're checking the boxes and taking care of what you need to take care of, I think there's a little bit of just, continue to do the right actions and accept the fact that the change that you're going to see over a short period of time it's going to be very hard to see.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a
Yeah.
good video game. Progress starts off really, really easy and fast and then kind of starts to plateau. And that's why, like, top of the world are, dealing with these like tiny percentage points or like fractions of percentage to get them to that next level. That like seems interesting to the layman, but like, you really don't have to fight for those percentage points. Just like eat another chicken breast and like you're probably gonna get a lot more out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add. I just made some notes here. We touched on sleep. We touched on quality and quantity of food. We touched on total volume, allostatic load, meaning just additional life stressors outside of training. The SFR piece, which is something we've talked about, but we haven't like used that definition. And so this is something that we talk a lot about in the hypertrophy intensive, and I think it's going to become increasingly something we talk about in a variety of different courses as well. But the stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is what Ryan was talking about earlier, and I think you had essentially labeled that as a little bit as being like training economy and being like an argument for either choosing different exercises that might have, like a really good example of this would be like a seated row, like upper back development, seated row versus bent over barbell row. You can create a context where like to your shoulder extensors, both can be the same based off of the amount of load in your hand. But the bent over row, because you need to hold that torso position and how it loads the trunk extensors, the hip extensors as well, just creates way more fatigue. And which is one of the reasons why I choose it for my own training. I like how that feels. And my primary goal isn't hypertrophy. And so enjoyment for me is something that I do prioritize. But if ever fatigue was getting in the accumulation of fatigue is getting in the way of your ability to continue to train and to drive stimulus, then that's where, once again, like you were saying, Rye, like choosing different exercises that have perhaps a bigger delta between stimulus and fatigue is great. So for those that for those that are listening, SFR is the term that we use to explain that, but it's not our term. I believe this was created by Renaissance Periodization. Yeah. Huge shout out to them. So we talked about training, execution, and then you also touched on the last piece, I believe you said, Rye, was that it's also normal for it to slow down. And so if we're talking about, like, are we talking about a novice trainee who's in their first few months who is just really hitting a wall in terms of fatigue? Or is this someone who's been doing it for a decade and they're surprised that they're now making incremental gains in contrast to the newbie gains, so to speak, that they had at the beginning? I think that's an important distinction. Last thing I'll say, because I really don't have much to add to this other than just to kind of like touch on your points again. The only thing I'll add to this is that, Ryan, when you were talking about this, you mentioned like, a new trainer could gain like 10 pounds of muscle in a year, and then down the road, you're fighting for 2. And so we use bodybuilding as an example of tabling this topic, but it also applies to a whole bunch of other goals as well. So for instance, the gentleman I was talking about earlier, or that I spoke with earlier today, who's a trail runner, in his context, like at the beginning, you're going to make lots of progress. Down the road, you're going to have to really work for those incremental improvements. And it'll also apply to competitive water polo players and, competitive, like, name a sport.
Literally anything, like playing guitar, like learning how to cook.
Exactly. Starting a podcast, like at the beginning, you make a lot of progress initially, but then eventually you're going to have to how would I say it? The progress is going to be a little slower, you know? Fuck. It would be nice if it just kept going quickly. So, yeah, no, I don't, that's the only thing that I would want to add, is that it doesn't just apply to the realm of bodybuilding, but that it extends beyond it. Other than that, I thought that both of your answers were really succinct and bang on. Is there anything that you guys want to add on that?
I was going to say, do we want to sneak one other training question in here?
Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it rapid fire if we can. Let's try to keep our answers to about 30 seconds to a minute each.
Stick with the basics or try to train optimally. I have some thoughts on this. I don't know if you want to go, Brett.
First one, then the other. If that, so I'm equating this to training for like an event, or like you've got a goal timeline potentially, because that's kind of where most of my training lies in. I would start with the basics, build kind of like a general strength base, a general aerobic base, and then as you get closer to the thing that you're trying to achieve, getting more and more specific and more optimal, which is just kind of like the basic foundation of periodization.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. My assumption, just because this like floats around the bodybuilding world a lot, it's like the word optimal has some negative connotation around it. Two thoughts on this. What I will say is we use this analogy a lot in the course, which is this idea that, you know, if you are a beginner or someone who's returning to training after a very long layoff, the bullseye to make progress is enormous.
Yes.
You can do anything and you're going to make an improvement. And the more and more experience that you become, and the more resistant to adaptation, the more specific that adaptation has to be, or that stimulus, has to be. So that's where having very customized exercise, I think, really matters, is when you've already kind of milked those quote unquote beginner gains, the bullseye just starts to get smaller and smaller. The other thing that I will add, because I think that it's a logical fallacy, the way that this gets presented a lot, like it's basics or optimal, like it's false dichotomy. People are always making decisions about optimization. Like the fact that you brought up the bent over row, you're still making a decision to optimize training your back. But like, why aren't you flapping your arms in the air? Because you've determined that bending over, picking up a bar and pulling it up into your sternum trains your back. So people just like have this arbitrary line in the sand of where now it becomes silly to do an exercise. Like if it's not a barbell or a dumbbell, that's funny. If it's not a barbell or
we're over
a
an
dumbbell,
hour, so it's normal for us to start stumbling over our words a bit. Yeah.
That, you know, inherently the exercise loses its like man card or something. I don't know. Like it's kind of a concept that I reject, because the other thing is, if we're talking about trying to optimize results, nobody will ever legitimately make the argument that training like a wimp is good for results. So picking exercises that are custom for an individual and then training them really hard is optimal training. Yeah. So I just think it's like this false dichotomy that gets presented in the fitness industry. So I actually kind of reject the concept entirely.
Yeah. It's almost like, you know, we're creating categories of types of exercises, or exercises that look a certain way, in contrast to perhaps coming back to what would make something quote unquote optimal for someone in the first place has to do with their goals, and which kind of comes to my answer, which is traditional training, I think was how it was worded, versus optimal.
Basics. But
basic. Yeah.
Stick to the basics, whatever.
Yeah. So my answer is whichever creates the better stimulus. I don't fucking, right? So like, that's how I would make the decision. So it's entirely person specific. So let's pull on this thread a little bit. If someone hates doing pull-ups, and let's say hypothetically, just on paper, that would provide objectively a better stimulus for the latissimus dorsi. Let's say, just for the sake of this conversation. And they're only able to, because they absolutely hate it, they're only willing to push up to 70% of what they could actually give. But then there's this other exercise that is maybe less objectively biomechanically effective at targeting the same muscle group, but that person can go hard on it. We then might reach a point where there's a tipping point where another exercise, because of other factors, leads to a superior stimulus. And I think that's kind of how I think about it, is it's like with every exercise, there's trades. You're making trades. And so then it's just like, which one of these is going to give us the greatest returns, is really kind of how I think about it. And you guys are math nerds, so you might find this interesting. But some of the questions I really liked in calculus were, and I don't know if it's the same language in when you study calculus in English as it was in French, but in French it was the translation would be optimization questions in mathematics, which was basically how can we like maximize the surface area under this curve, period. That was like the only thing that you're looking at, and you're looking to figure out what's going to be the answer to this kind of equation or whatever to maximize the area underneath that curve. And you guys can probably feel free to correct me here, but what I'm getting at,
I think you're bang on. I think you're usually trying to find like the maximum of a parabola.
There you go.
Yeah, integration is area under the curve.
I love nerds, man. This is great. So what I'm getting at is that, if you think of like whether that be the area underneath that curve as being the stimulus, or the area underneath that curve being the response, which technically it would be probably the response you would care more about than the stimulus itself, then it's really just whatever is going to drive that. So if for someone, they're at a certain season of their life where they are just going hard with Bosu ball stuff and they're not willing to put a barbell on their back, yeah, man, your entry point into exercise for them just might have to be the Bosu ball right now. Mm-hmm. And, sure, you can't load it nearly as much, but maybe that's okay when you consider the larger context of this person, So I agree with everything you guys said. I agree that, like you were saying, Rai, that it's kind of like the wrong question to ask. And I think that perhaps bring it back to at least what one of my beliefs apparently, which is that, that which is optimal is very much like case specific, it's person specific. And doing a seated row the way that Ryan likes doing them might feel like dog shit for me. And that's okay. And it's just about kind of figuring out what's going to work for each person.
I think you said one thing there that's worth
just one.
Use your language, double click on.
Thing.
Just one. The rest is bullshit.
That's the story of my life.
I do think that asking your clients what exercises they like and integrating that matters. Mm-hmm. Especially a lot of the clientele that I work with now are generally pretty experienced trainees. So they have plenty of their own experience with certain exercises that they like and whatever, a certain flavor in terms of their technique. And while I might suggest certain modifications and we'll make certain changes if they're open to that, if there are things that they love to do, if I can find a way to incorporate that into their training program, it's going to build trust, but it's also going to build their enjoyment within the program.
The jazz,
and especially
factor. The jazzed factor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, that goes a really long way. So I think it is important to not just completely impose our will on our clients, especially if it's half a dozen one way, six the other. Pick the thing that they like. I have clients do exercises that I don't really like all that much, mm-hmm. and they might not necessarily be my first choice, but they like doing them. And I'm like, the difference is so small. It's, as you had mentioned, they're probably more likely to work hard at it. And that's going to be the thing that tips the scales to that maybe being a better choice.
I'll share with you guys a quick little story, perhaps as before we wrap up here, if we have time. Do you guys need to jet or we're good?
Sure.
So when I really started going hard into the kind of like biomechanical world, and I started doing the mastery program with RTS in OKC. There's a lot of acronyms there. I lost my train of thought because that was really funny. Right. So when I was going hard into the biomechanical world, I went to, I think it was the CanFit Pro conference, and I got really frustrated with the amount of people that were just doing fun exercise. Like, so many people, like the class on kettlebell juggling was fucking sold out. But then the class on, I don't know, like the neuroscience of rehab or nutritional periodization for endurance athletes or for bodybuilders, like really sciencey things, the room was like half full. I got really irritated about that. And what I've learned over the years is just like that those things that people enjoy are really useful, right? Like just like the things that, like the enjoyment factor. And this is, once again, shout out to Renaissance Periodization, because they've made lots of really great graphs. One of the graphs that they have like a pyramid, like a 3-dimensional pyramid that they created that shows like this hierarchy of nutrition and then the hierarchy for program design. And, they talk about like exercises, sets and reps, volume, tempo, all that stuff. All those things are there, but the dark side of the pyramid is adherence, right? And it's like, it takes up way larger surface area than the others, as it should. And I think that like, so to come back to one of the things that you guys have said many times is just that like enjoyment can't be understated, because bodybuilding is a marathon, training for a marathon is a marathon, like all like powerlifting is a marathon. All of these things require a lot of repetition and a lot of time. And so, and enjoyment drives adherence. And it comes back to perhaps my final point for this evening, which is a concept that we talk about a lot on this podcast, is to be cautious of losing the forest for the trees. Because it's true that, there are more efficient ways to train your glutes to train your hip extensors, because your glutes aren't the only hip extensor. There are way more efficient ways to train your hip extensors than kettlebell juggling. Like I would say, if like rep per rep, objectively, there are more efficient ways to do so. And if you can easily get kind of lost in that truth and lose sight of the larger context that like we're dealing with a human here. And so I love that you asked that question, Rai, to your clients of like, what are things that you enjoy? It's a question that I also ask every single one of my clients as well. It's also something that I ask people in a rehabilitative context. I ask the question a little bit different, but it's essentially a similar question, which is like, what do you think you need? And I usually will find ways to integrate that into their plan, because at least in my experience, it drives a lot of adherence. So it's very similar. The goal is to, how can I triple down on adherence, or consider adherence while also concurrently considering perhaps what do they need mechanistically? You know what I mean? And finding this kind of balance between the two. So those are my closing thoughts. What do you guys have to say before we wrap?
I think it was a great answer.
Yeah. Good chat.
Sweet. Awesome. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for today. That was great. I'm going to post this, what are we? We are Tuesday. So I'm going to be releasing this Thursday of this week. Thank you for carving out the time for this conversation, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank
Cheers.
you. See you
Later.
later.